There's a saying that I really like that helps to really quickly summarize all of the high points and all of the low points of world history. That helps to explain why no great empire has ever managed to maintain its strength forever and has managed to maintain progress forever, but instead every great human empire has always backpedaled and eventually been destroyed, or more often has destroyed itself. And that saying goes like this: hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. In the United States of America right now, it increasingly seems like we are in the last phase of that progression, where good times have created weak men, and now weak men seem to either be intentionally or not creating hard times. And really, the American century, for all intents and purposes, might already be over. And it's all because of a couple of decisions that were made over the course of just a couple of weeks that have irrevocably destroyed trust in the United States of America and have destroyed the pillars that made the United States so wealthy and so powerful to begin with. Right now, changes are happening so rapidly that most Americans are not even aware of them yet. And I think I am one of the exceptions because I have this YouTube channel which allows me to interact with a majority audience that is Europeans or people from other parts of the world. And that audience gives me a lens into how the rest of the world actually thinks right now that most Americans may not see for several months or maybe even several years. But that view that I am seeing is very palpable within the past month or so. A massive change in sentiment of people, citizens of other nations, towards the United States. People increasingly not only do not trust the United States anymore, but they actively distrust us and no longer want to be in our sphere of influence. And what we're seeing, which I'll describe in a few parts throughout this video, is really a new multipolar world that seems to be forming very rapidly to replace the hole that U.S. influence is creating. Right now, those signs are small. Perhaps this is reversible, but probably not if the decisions that are being made continue to be made. So let me explain a little bit what's going on. First, let's start with a quick summary of the foundations of power that have over the past century made the United States the most powerful and the wealthiest nation in human history. And then I want to explain how the United States is now actively kicking out those pillars of power from beneath their own feet. All empires throughout all of human history have gained power on two major pillars. The first is military dominance, and the second is world trade. And pretty much without exception, any nation that wanted to be great throughout history pursued those two objectives in a number of different ways. Sometimes those objectives manifested themselves more peacefully, where the people that were basically being subject to that nation or that empire were more or less happy about the outcome. Often the nations that were subjected to the power of that empire weren't happy, and it just depended on how things played out. The United States, of course, as the most powerful nation in the world right now, is no exception to those two rules. And really, over the past century, the primary reason the United States has gotten so wealthy and so powerful is because they intentionally set out to be a global country. They did this in a way that is arguably different than any other empire in human history, but nevertheless, they did it. Where over the past 100 years, and especially in the period following World War II, the United States explicitly pursued a strategy of globalism. We wanted the wealth and the goods of all the nations around the world, and to help protect those interests, we built a massive military with military bases all over the place. And in particular, we built an extremely powerful global navy. Now, we use this military and this navy differently than most empires did prior to us, which is we sought primarily to protect other nations, to keep people within our sphere of influence, so that they would willingly want to work with us and willingly trade with us and allow us to reap the benefits. But one way or another, the United States got wealthy because of military dominance and because of global.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter, H-Talk Stories. There's something that I want us to talk about. Last year, time like this, if you can remember quite vividly, everyone was happy. Everyone was receiving some sort of messianic message that Mr. Donald Trump is going to be changing the United States. We are going to see, they were expecting a huge change. They were expecting a huge United States growth. But all of these things were just a bubble, which marks today 1 year. All along 2025, you have seen all those crazy stuff that has been happening, right? And people celebrated Mr. Donald Trump. People endorsed Mr. Donald Trump. I'm not saying that Mr. Donald Trump should be perfect, just like Jesus or anybody. But I'm trying to say that there are those mistakes that he made that was so much, I even don't know how to describe it, but it was crazy that people were brainwashed. I'd use the word brainwashed. People were promised something that they cannot see. People are promised something that they cannot touch. And I could see all the social media outlets, the mainstream media, trying to air out how liberals are crying. And it was a massive laugh towards the liberals. But there's something that I think these people knew, or these people saw. That's why they were so much against Mr. Donald Trump getting into the seat. In this video, I'm going to be explaining to you what Mr. Donald Trump has done 2025 that has made the life of people of the United States so much hard than ever before. So buckle up for this video, because I'm going to be explaining to you one by one everything that happened along this year that really made life so much hard for the citizens of the United States. So buckle up for this video. I'm going to be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. And hey, if you're watching me for the first time, I'm asking you to please subscribe to my channel. Probably you're coming across this channel for the first time, right? I'm asking you to please subscribe to the channel. I'm your number one host and presenter, H-Talk Stories. So let's get into it. I'll be back with my thoughts in regards to this, right? So the person who is presenting the video is called Paul Rollback. For those who are always asking, I'm also going to be sharing the link in the description or in the comment section, which is going to be pinned. So stay tuned as you watch the video. I'll be back.
Trade. However, over the past couple of decades, it has become increasingly clear that Americans do not understand this basic set of facts, and they have begun to actively work against these interests, seeing America's globalism as a cost center rather than a benefit center, seeing our need to be interconnected with the world as something that is taking away from us rather than something that is adding to us. Why we feel this way, it's difficult to say. Perhaps it's just because we have so much wealth that we're spending so much time consuming that wealth that we don't spend any time reading books or reading our own history to understand where we came from. And increasingly, we have seen a certain segment of the United States wanting to withdraw from this world order even though the United States is the one who created the world order, and they created it primarily for their own benefit. We have seen that manifest itself since Donald Trump has taken office for the second time in a very explicit way. Donald Trump has come into office and he has made several different statements and several different moves that all separately could have undermined the United States' position in the world order, and combined, they definitely are pushing other nations away from us. These include combinations of things like saying that we want to take Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada, stuff that sounds like it should be made up or people putting words in Trump's mouth that he never said. But all of these things have been explicitly marked as goals by Donald Trump, and they're things that he has repeated several times, and it's clear that he is trying to move towards these goals as a matter of policy. On top of all of that, Trump has come out of the gate attempting to put tariffs on all of the United States' major trading partners between Canada and China and Mexico, about half of U.S. global trade, although he has backed out a couple of times after he's realized that these policies are devastating towards the United States' own economy. And then finally, Donald Trump has, at least as of now, paused military aid towards Ukraine and has made a move that really changes directions from decades of U.S. foreign policy. Now, as I said, all of these things are working together to undermine the two major pillars that have made the United States so wealthy and powerful, that being military dominance and global trade. I keep repeating those because I just really want to hammer the point home. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just being repetitive for no reason. Obviously, things like tariffs undermine the United States' global position in trade because they completely reverse course on what was the goal of the United States in trade for several decades, and in what, in fact, has been the goal of every great global empire throughout human history, which was to receive more goods from other countries than you had to give yourself. It's called a trade deficit, and it's not a bad thing. It's actually been the goal of human empires since human empires were first conceived. But now the United States is trying to make goods, cheap goods from other countries, more expensive on purpose so that they can do the hard work of producing and they can pay higher prices. It doesn't make much sense, especially from a historical standpoint, but it's what they're doing. Now, in addition to that, from a military standpoint, the United States is undermining the military dominance that made so many nations want to trade with them in the first place. Of course, again, when we look at global empires have always tried to use their military to get more trade with other nations in one of two ways. One was the colony way, which was let's go and actually physically take territory and protect it and use the military to protect our interests to force the people who live there to send goods back to the home country. But there's another way where you can get the people to do that for you willingly by using your military to help protect them. And then because they are grateful for your protection, they are willing to live within your sphere of influence. That is the strategy that the United States has been pursuing, and now they're undermining that in two major ways. The first is obvious, where the United States for many decades has been willing to engage in warfare to protect the nations that are their friends and allies. We now see the United States backing away from Ukraine and actually being a little bit belligerent about their responsibility as the leading global power, saying that they don't want the costs of engaging in warfare or even supporting another nation while they engage in warfare. They just want the benefits of being a global empire. They don't want the responsibilities. At the same time, the United States is making statements that are at least making other countries nervous that they are shifting from the protection kind of empire to just the straight up take by force kind of empire. We see the United States saying things like, let's take the Panama Canal, let's take Greenland, let's make Canada the 51st state. And that is making people nervous about the United States' intentions. And it is causing them to back more and more away from U.S. influence. And they're not so willing to do it from their heart now. It's getting to the point where the United States might actually have to force them to do it, which they won't be very successful at. We see, for example, as the United States goes after Canada with tariffs, a huge buy Canadian and buy European movement is starting in Canada because people no longer want to trade with or trust the United States any longer. And we see similar things happening in Europe. And so with just a couple of moves, we have undermined the foundations of our empire. What might happen next? Well, obviously, it is too soon to say exactly where things could ultimately go, but there are some signals of what is already happening. And one of the first signals is that in the wake of all of these decisions, the Swiss government, which was in negotiations for a contract to buy F-35s from the United States, now has a lot of voices in their parliament that are saying they're not sure if they want to make a deal for their own protection that relies on the United States. And we might see a lot more things like this happening. Because when the United States shows that at the flip of a hat, at the flip of an administration, they can completely change their interests and change the way they look at the world, nations aren't going to want to be dependent on us for major weapons systems that require training and parts and maintenance from the United States. Now, that might seem like a small thing, but it's not a small thing at all if that trend opens up and broadens up. Because one of the reasons the United States continues to be the most powerful military on the planet is because of the power we get by selling our military systems to other countries. Military systems, of course, like any other kind of technology, are very expensive to develop, and the main cost is in the research and development, not the production of individual units. So for a long time, the way that the United States has funded our own military is by building up this global trust and getting people to want to buy our weapons from us, which reduces the cost of us developing our weapons by allowing us to spread those costs among other nations. That's part of what has allowed our military to become so technologically advanced, because we can afford to do that because we have a global system that we sit at the top of that is built primarily on trust. With that trust broken, people are going to look to purchase weapon systems from other countries. That is going to increase the cost of weapons development, not just for us, but for everybody else who was in our sphere of influence. While our adversaries are not going to have the same problems, and it is going to erode our military edge that to this point has kept us head and shoulders above China. This is just one thing that could happen, and it's one example of how bad things can get. Now, the really sad part is that a large reason that this could happen and that trends are going to move in this direction is because the United States was so upset about how much money they were spending giving weapons to Ukraine that they decided to basically back out of those deliveries with no notice to Ukraine, and now the trust is broken. But the massive irony is that over the course of over 3 years, the United States has given less equipment in terms of monetary value to Ukraine than they sell on an annual basis to other countries around the world. In fact, less than half. So over the course of 3 years, we've given Ukraine a little bit over 100 billion US dollars worth of equipment. Every year, we sell approximately 215 billion, or maybe it's 285 billion. I can't remember the exact number, dollars worth of military equipment to other countries. And now, because we didn't want to keep up that aid, other countries are trusting us less and are now looking to develop their own systems rather than buying from us. So it's one of these situations where the United States is being penny wise and pound foolish, stepping over dollars to pick up nickels. Basically, because we don't want to give a little bit of money away, we have jeopardized a very profitable and a very strategically important industry. And again, this is just one example of what is happening now that the United States has undermined its global trust across the rest of the world. Now, what we tell the media is that the reason that we are doing all of these things is that we are trying to protect American interests. And when it comes to Ukraine, we say we're trying to avoid World War III. But there's a lot of ironies in all of these claims. First of all, World War III has already been avoided, and it was during the Cold War when the United States had a massive adversary in the Soviet Union and a massive nuclear arms race. At that time, World War III was avoided not because the United States backed down, but because the United States stood up and unified with its European partners, creating something called NATO. Maybe you've heard about it. NATO is a very important institution that kept the world out of war through strength, by showing our enemies that if they wanted war, it would be too costly for them. And because of those actions, our enemies didn't pursue war. But now we see the United States taking actions that show that they may want to back away from NATO. They are pretty belligerent about NATO growing in power, even though, again, that is what kept the world out of war over the past several decades. Now, on top of all of that, we see the United States making these bizarre statements about Greenland and how we need to possess Greenland because of its strategic importance, apparently not realizing that we can already possess all of the strategic importance of Greenland without having to take it from anybody, just by continuing to support and uphold the world order that we worked so hard to create. The United States, of course, historically has had military bases on Greenland, even though it isn't our own territory. Because we have been part of this international community, that nation has been more than willing to invite the United States to take part in being on Greenland and use the island for its strategic position without the United States having to take it over. Now we see the United States saying we want to take it, we want it to be given to us, whatever, one way or another, we're going to get it, while at the same time saying that they want to back away from NATO. And again, we see this move from the old kind of empire that the United States was, the better kind, the kind that protected global interests in partnership with other nations, to basically saying, well, we want to do things on our own. We don't want to have to be involved in other nations at all. Again, we want all the benefits. We want none of the costs. But here's the problem, America. When we don't pay the costs, when we don't pay the bills for the world that has made us so prosperous, we don't get to keep the benefits. The world is going to back away from us if we continue to act like that. And so it is up to us to change the narrative, to read our own history books, to realize where we came from, and to turn things around before it's too late. Now, this can be done. Already, 2 different times, Donald Trump has indeed backed down on his tariff threats against Mexico and Canada. in part because he was forced to see the reality of the debilitating economic effects this would have on his own nation, and in part because brave voices within his own party stood up and told him the truth, and he finally listened for a rare, brief moment. In order to turn this ship around, all conservatives need to do is embrace the voices that their party was not ashamed to speak in the past. Ronald Reagan, of course, was a big conservative, one of the most conservative presidents we ever had, who upheld these two pillars of American global influence. And now we see those who would speak along the same lines as Reagan, afraid to do so because they are terrified of being labeled as a liberal or a neocon just for disagreeing with Donald Trump. But the reality is that you're not a neocon if you do that. Those who would shut you down for doing that, they are the new conservatives. They are the neocons. They are the ones trying to change the narrative and take over what used to be a good party for their own purposes. You can win. You just have to be brave enough to speak up. Now, I know that a lot of people watching this video, a lot of people in my audience will certainly not agree with every point that was made in this video. That's okay. I don't have a problem with you if you don't have a problem with me. I hope you can see the importance of the message in this video and the intent behind it. And if you want to support more work like this, if I could ask you for a quick favor before you go, would you consider becoming a patron of this channel? We're going to continue doing everything we can to uphold the United States' global position that has benefited so much of the world by encouraging our government to support Ukraine, to not treat our allies like they are our enemies, and to do everything we can to continue to uphold the foundations of what has been one of the most peaceful periods in all of human history. To learn more about becoming a patron, just scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the description of this video. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.
So, from Make America Great Again to Make America Worst Again, the following are the things that Mr. Donald Trump did to make the United States much worse than he found it. First, he undermined democratic institutions and oversight structures. That's the first thing. One of the most consequential trends in 2025 has been the Trump administration extensively reshaping or dismantling of internal government oversight mechanism. Early in the year, Trump fired at least 17 inspector generals, the independent watchdogs who monitored federal agencies for waste, fraud, and abuse in what critics call a purge that eroded checks and balances essential to democratic governance. This mass dismissal raised alarms among legal scholars who warn that removal of independent oversight not only weakens accountability, but also consolidates power in ways that blur the separation of powers fundamental to the U.S. Constitution, constitutional democracy. Without a robust or robust internal auditing, federal agencies can become less transparent and more political driven, increasing the risk of abuses of authority and decreasing public trust in governance institutions. That's the first thing that he did. He fired all the watchdogs that could make him accountable. Two, the second thing that he did is federal shutdown and workforce layoff. There have been massive layoff, but let's talk about it. In late 2025, the federal government faced partisan gridlock that triggered a shutdown, during which plans were put in motion for permanent workforce reduction across agencies, rather than the typical temporary fall-through. Federal workers in critical departments like the Patent Office, the CDC, Homeland Security, Treasury, Education, and Energy received layoff notices. Since these departments handle everything from public health surveillance and scientific research to economic regulation and national security, dramatic cuts strain government capacity to respond to crises and provide essential services. Economists caution that such workforce reductions diminish effective governance and create a long term that undermine economic stability and public confidence. And so you understand how this is making the America worse, worse, and worse. The third thing was the retreat from climate leadership and environmental agreements. On his first day in office in 2025, Trump signed an executive order formally withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement and related climate commitments, reversing years of coordinated global action to curb greenhouse gas emission. Understand that this step not only isolated the US from coalition diplomacy on environmental issues, but also undermines America's credibility as a global leader in science-informed climate policy. Also, by rejecting multilateral cooperation and rolling back domestic environmental regulations designed to reduce pollution and expand renewable energy, the US faces increased long-term economic risks associated with climate change, including extreme weather damage, public health impacts, and lost competitiveness in emerging clean energy industries. So is United States getting better? Definitely no. The fourth thing that he did was he strained international relations and trade turmoil. And I think Paul Wilberg have tried to address this, but I'm gonna do this, right? Trump's aggressive, America first, trade posture in 2025 revived sharp tariff escalations that analysts argue have destabilized global supply chains and provoked retaliatory actions by U.S. trading partners. This includes China, this includes Japan, this includes India. We have seen back and forth those retaliatory policies, which goes ahead and still affecting the people of the United States, right? So economists warn that increased tariffs on imports have raised production costs, disrupted trade flows, and dampened investor confidence. Research on tariffs impacts suggests that such protectionist measures can shrink export, reduce employment in export-dependent sectors, and slow overall economic growth. Markets reacted with heightened volatility, and sectors that rely heavily on international trade, such as agriculture and manufacturing, felt disproportionately pressured. Tariff-induced uncertainty is a drag on economic activity precisely because global industries are deeply interconnected. So you understand how all these are affecting the United States and the performance of the United States as a country, right? The fifth thing is escalation of immigration enforcement with economic consequences. Yes, the United States, we all have to agree on this. The United States heavily rely on immigrant labor. We'll all have to agree on this. And the escalation which brought about the immigration crisis, you saw how it affected the United States big time and how it affected it negatively, right? Now, the Trump era intensification of immigration and customs enforcement, the ICE, raids and deportation has had knocked on impact beyond politics. It has disrupted key industries dependent on migrant labor, especially agriculture. Econometrics modeling from 2025 shows that labor shortages caused by aggressive immigration enforcement reduced crop yields, pushed up food prices, and broadly strained supply chains that rely on stable workforce. Most economists recognize that agriculture in the US depends on immigrant labor for harvesting and processing, and shrinking that workforce abruptly can generate substantial economic harm. Policies that overly tighten labor flows without viable legal pathways They risk compounded economic and social damage. And so you understand how all these things goes, right? Um, the sixth thing was public health weakening by withdrawing from WHO and defunding the research that the United States have been conducting for the longest time. And this is crazy because according to the health policies analysis, one of the drastic shifts in 2025 was the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization and sweeping restrictions on federal health agencies, funding, and operations. These moves, coupled with suspended research contracts and halting of new grants at the agencies like the NIH and the CDC, threaten public health preparedness. Experts assert that limiting America's engagement with the WHO jeopardizes international disease surveillance and outbreak responses, undermining global efforts to contain epidemics. Domestically, freezing research grants constrain scientific innovation in critical areas, from infectious diseases to chronic health conditions, impacting economic productivity and long term health outcomes to the citizens of the United States. The seventh thing that he did also was the federal overreach into local law enforcement. In August 2025, Trump invoked emergency powers to federal law enforcement in Washington, D.C., asserting control over the Metropolitan Police Department in response to perceived crime spikes despite official crime statistics showing declines. This unprecedented use of federal authority to override local governance raised concerns about civil liberties, community trust, and appropriate limits of executive power. Critics argue that substituting federal force for locally accountable police risks undermining the democratic principles of local self-determination, eroding community relation, and politicizing law enforcement in ways that can fuel social polarization rather than solve underlying issues, right? And the eighth thing that he did was healthcare policy ambivalence with risks for coverage stability. In late 2025, Trump declared that he had no comprehensive healthcare beyond letting the Affordable Care Act, that's the Obamacare, repel itself by attrition rather than providing stable replacement policy. At the same time, Republican leadership backed legislation that would cut ACA subsidies, likely raising premiums for millions of Americans. Policy analysts warned that such an approach could leave nearly 24 million Americans facing high healthcare costs and reduced access to insurance, um, especially during economic uncertainty. A lack of proactive healthcare strategy can strain emergency services, increasing uncompensated care costs and destabilizing labor markets where health coverage is often tied to employment. The ninth thing is classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction and militarizing the drug war. In December, just recently, 2025, Trump signed an executive order des- uh, designating fentanyl a synthetic opioid, a weapon of mass destruction, um, authorizing the use of military intelligence tools typically reserved for national defense. This unprecedented classification has drawn legal and public concerns over civil liberties and the militarization of drug enforcement. And the critics argue that conflating public health cries with hard security measures can divert resources from proven community-based treatment and prevention strategies and risks escalating conflict with foreign suppliers instead of addressing demand and rehabilitation domestically. The militarization response also raises complex legal questions about the appropriate use of defense authorities inside and outside US border. The 10th thing was limited positive impact on regulatory shifts. That's cannabis policies as an example. Even in policy areas perceived as reformist, like rescheduling marijuana from Scheduling 1 to Scheduling 3, in the immediate market and economic effects, have been underwhelming. While the moves was intended to ease restrictions and stimulate industry growth, cannabis stock fell sharply in reaction, reflecting investor disappointment that the change did not meaningfully expand legal commercial markets. This illustrates a broader pattern of policy ambiguity. Decisions that can Decisions that signal reform but lack a substantive implementation can retaliate uncertainty that harms economic sectors or rather than help them. Um, Regulatory unpredictability undermines investment planning and erodes confidence in governance direction. Please, brothers and sisters, I'm your host and presenter Ejidok Stories. Please let me know what you think about this video. I know I've left out a couple of things like farmers being affected, right? You understand all these concepts are intertwined with Mr. Donald Trump regime. So please, brothers and sisters, let me know what you think about this video. Again, I'm your number one host and presenter Ejidok Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.